-30 degrees. At this cold, your body stops being a machine and becomes a target. My Humvee died miles back. Now it's just me against the white, frozen void of the Sierras. Then, a desperate bark broke the storm. A dog appeared, fur matted with ice, defying the wind. The animal lunged, grabbing my sleeve. It wasn't an attack. It was a silent, primal plea for help. I looked down the ravine. A splash of blue fabric lay there, half buried in the freezing depths. No signal. No backup. I hammered an anchor into the ice. A seal never leaves anyone behind. I dropped into the dark. The rope was slick with frost, every inch a gamble with death. I dug frantically. I found her, an elderly woman, her face a pale mask of frozen white ice. I searched for a pulse. It was faint and irregular, but she was still fighting for life. The dog watched from above. We were miles from help. The real battle for survival starts now. Survival is a cold math equation, and she was losing heat fast. I stripped off my primary thermal layer, letting the wind bite into my skin like needles, and wrapped her in my heavy shell. My own body began to shake with violent, involuntary shudders, but I had to become her furnace, her only hope against the frost. I couldn't carry her out of this steep ravine on my back. The incline was too slick and unstable. I pulled my combat knife and started hacking at the frozen limbs of a fallen pine nearby. My hands were becoming wooden, losing their dexterity, but I needed a makeshift litter to drag her through the deepening drifts. Using high-tensile paracord from my emergency kit, I lashed the branches into a crude frame. I used my own jacket as the bed of the sled, creating a tactical litter that would slide over the crust of the snow. Every knot had to be perfect. If this sled broke in the middle of the blizzard, she was a dead woman. I settled her into the litter and whistled for the dog. The animal scrambled down the slope, exhausted but loyal, and immediately curled its massive, shaggy body against her side. It was a desperate synergy of heat and survival. I felt her stir for a second, her eyelids fluttering against the ice, but she remained silent. I harnessed myself to the sled with my climbing rope. The first pull nearly broke my spirit. The weight of the woman, the dog, and the friction of the snow felt like dragging an anchor. I dug my boots into the ice, my thighs screaming in protest as I fought for every inch of elevation against the gale. My vision began to tunnel, the world narrowing down to the next agonizing pull. Sweat formed under my gear and instantly turned to ice, a dangerous sign of overexertion. I focused on the rhythm of my boots, a mantra of one more step echoing in my skull. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a machine of pure will. We breached the rim of the ravine, and the full force of the storm hit us like a physical blow. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, when I felt a frail, freezing hand touch my arm. The woman's eyes were open, cloudy but focused, and her lips moved in a faint, desperate whisper that cut through the wind. "Not the road," she rasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones. She pointed a trembling finger away from the main path, toward a dense, dark wall of timber that didn't appear on any of my maps. "Follow the old spirit trail. The stones will guide you." I didn't ask how she knew. I just turned the sled and headed into the deep dark. The old spirit trail wasn't a path. It was a ghost of one. I pushed into the tree line, where the ancient pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches groaning under the weight of 1,000 winters. The wind died down here, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that made the crunch of my boots sound like gunshots. My compass was spinning uselessly. likely due to magnetite in the surrounding rock, but the woman kept whispering directions, her eyes fixed on things I couldn't see. "Left at the weeping cedar," she'd breathe, "right where the stone teeth rise." I was operating on blind faith and the raw instinct of a predator. Suddenly, a jagged monolith of black stone erupted from the drifts, exactly as she had described. It looked like a rotting tooth in the jaw of the mountain. My SEAL training taught me to trust my gear, but out here, in this forgotten corner of the world, my gear was failing. My flashlight flickered and died, the batteries drained by the impossible cold. I was forced to rely on the pale, sickly light of the moon filtering through the storm clouds. Every shadow looked like a crouching beast, and the exhaustion began to play tricks on my mind, turning the wind's whistle into human screams. I felt the darkness closing in, not just from the forest, but from within. Hypothermia is a seductive killer. It whispers that it's okay to sit down, that the snow is actually a warm bed. My knees buckled, and I hit the ground, the cold leaching the last of my strength. I felt the dog's wet, frozen snout press against my bare hand, a sharp jolt of reality. It barked, a low, commanding rumble that vibrated in my chest. "Not yet, soldier," I snarled at myself, forcing my body back upright. I grabbed the rope, the fibers biting into my shoulders, and leaned into the harness once more. The woman's voice was getting weaker, a mere thread of sound in the frozen air. She pointed toward a narrow gap between two massive boulders that looked like they were leaning against each other for warmth. "There," she gasped, "the hidden gate. Follow the smell of cedar and old iron." To any other man, it looked like a dead end, a wall of rock and ice. But as I approached, I saw the faint outlines of a trail that hadn't been walked by anyone but her in decades. It was a secret passage through the mountain's spine, a shortcut through the heart of the storm. We emerged from the trees into a clearing that felt like a different world. The wind was a distant roar, blocked by the natural fortress of the peaks. In the center stood a small cabin, its wooden walls silvered by age and its roof sagging under several feet of snow. It looked like a tomb, silent and forgotten. But to me it was a palace. Smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, and there were no lights in the windows. But the dog suddenly went wild, breaking away from the sled and racing toward the door. It knew we were home, or at least at the end of the line. I reached the door and threw my weight against it. The wood groaned, the iron hinges screaming in protest as they broke free from the ice that had sealed them shut. A wave of stale, cold air hit me, smelling of dry wood, lavender, and ancient dust. I dragged the sled inside, the woman shivering violently now as her body realized the immediate threat of the wind was gone. I slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy iron bolt. We were inside, but the battle wasn't over. The cabin was a freezer, and if I didn't get a fire started in the next 10 minutes, we would all be frozen statues by dawn. The air inside was so cold, it felt brittle, like glass waiting to shatter. I ignored my own trembling hands and moved toward the center of the room, where a massive, rusted cast-iron stove stood like a sleeping titan. I cleared the years of dust with a sweep of my arm, the gray particles dancing in the beam of my headlamp. My mission was clear. Heat is life. I found a stack of birch logs, bone dry and smelling of sap, neatly piled in the corner, as if they'd been waiting for this exact moment for 2 decades. I prepped the kindling with the precision of a demolitions expert, my focus narrowing down to a single spark. I struck my magnesium fire starter, and a shower of white-hot sparks cascaded onto the dry shavings. For a second, nothing happened. And then a tiny, defiant tongue of orange flame licked the wood. I nursed it, breathing slowly, shielding the infant fire with my cupped hands as if it were the most precious thing on earth. The shadows in the cabin began to retreat, fleeing from the growing warmth that started to radiate from the iron. The smell of wood smoke filled the room, a scent that meant survival, comfort, and a temporary truce with the storm outside. I moved the woman closer to the stove, stripping away the wet, frozen layers of her clothing and wrapping her in thick, moth-eaten wool blankets I found in a cedar chest. She was still unconscious, but her breathing was becoming deeper, more rhythmic. The dog curled up at her feet, its tail giving a single tired thump against the floorboards. I checked my tactical watch. The temperature inside was rising slowly, degree by painful degree. I melted snow in a blackened tin pot I found on the mantel, preparing to hydrate her the moment she woke. The immediate crisis was over, but the silence of the cabin began to weigh on me. As the warmth spread, I finally took a look around. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a museum of a life interrupted. One wall was covered in framed photographs, their edges curled and yellowed by time. My headlamp swept over them, and I saw images of a younger version of the woman, standing proudly next to a tall man in a forester's uniform. But it was the other items that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a simple nail was a set of military dog tags and a bronze star medal, its ribbon faded, but its significance unmistakable. This was the home of a warrior's family. On the heavy oak table sat a map, much like mine, but hand-drawn with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Red circles marked the old Spirit Trail and the Hidden Gate, the very places that had saved our lives tonight. I realized then that she hadn't been guessing. She was reciting a map she had memorized over a lifetime of waiting. The map was dated 20 years ago, the ink faded, but the intent clear. It was a search grid, a desperate attempt to find someone lost in these mountains. My training told me that people don't just disappear here. The mountains swallow them whole. I picked up a small wooden bird from the shelf, carved with incredible detail. On the bottom, a name was etched in the wood. Ethan. The name hit me like a physical blow. In my community, the legend of Ethan Thorne was a ghost story told to recruits, a legendary SEAL who vanished during a localized training exercise in these very mountains 2 decades ago. They never found his body, never found his gear. He just walked into the whiteout and became part of the Sierra legend. I looked at the woman on the floor and realized I was looking at his mother. The weight of the coincidence settled on my chest, heavier than my rucksack. I was a SEAL 20 years later, standing in the living room of a man whose shadow I had been chasing since I put on the uniform. Fate is a strange beast. It had used a dog and a blizzard to drag me through a secret forest to the one person who still kept Ethan's memory alive. I felt a strange sense of belonging, as if the cabin itself recognized my gait, my gear, the way I carried myself. I wasn't a stranger here. I was a brother in arms returning to a post that had been vacant for too long. A soft moan came from the blankets. The woman's eyes opened, no longer cloudy with the fog of near death. She looked at the ceiling, then at the fire, and finally, her gaze landed on me. She didn't look surprised or scared. She looked relieved. A faint smile touched her cracked lips as she saw my trident insignia on my gear, glowing in the firelight. "You're late," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "But he told me you'd come. He said another one would find the way when the storm was right." I leaned in, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who told you?" I asked. though I already knew the answer. She reached out a frail hand and touched the sleeve of my uniform. My Ethan. He's been the one keeping the stove dry, keeping the wood stacked. He knew I'd get lost one day. He knew I'd need a guardian. She spoke of him not as a ghost, but as a presence that still inhabited the corners of this cabin, a silent watchman who had guided my every step through that impossible forest. I followed her gaze to a dark corner behind the stove. There, half hidden by a heavy wool cloak, sat a rucksack. It was an older model, the kind used in the early 2000s, but it was meticulously maintained. It was Ethan's gear, ready for a mission that never ended. In that moment, the cabin felt crowded, as if the air was thick with the spirits of men who refused to quit. I realized then that my survival tonight wasn't a result of my training alone. It was a coordinated operation between the living and the dead. I reached for the rucksack with trembling fingers, the nylon feeling unnaturally cold beneath my touch. When the zipper gave way, I wasn't met with the smell of rot or dampness, but the sharp, crisp scent of gun oil and peppermint, as if it had been packed only an hour ago. Inside, every piece of kit was laid out with surgical precision: a tactical radio, a sealed first aid kit, and a set of clean thermal layers. Resting on top was a small silver locket, tarnished by years but still holding a quiet dignity. I clicked it open, and the flickering firelight revealed the face of the woman on the floor, 20 years younger, her eyes sparkling with laughter in a sun-drenched meadow. This wasn't a forgotten relic of a dead man. It was a mission-ready kit waiting for a hand to claim it. I realized that the gear wasn't just preserved, it was curated, maintained by a ghost who refused to abandon his post. The dog watched me, its tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the floorboards, its eyes deep and knowing as if it were witnessing the passing of a torch. A frail, freezing hand slid over mine, her grip surprisingly firm for someone who had nearly been a corpse an hour ago. "He knew the mountain would be too much for me this year," she whispered, her voice no longer a rasp, but a clear, melodic thread that seemed to resonate with the cabin itself. She didn't look at me with fear, but with the weary relief of a mother who had finally seen her son's friend arrive. Every winter, he guides the lost ones, the hikers who wander too far, the animals trapped in the drifts. But this time the storm was too big, and he needed a brother. He needed someone who could carry the weight he no longer could. I looked toward the window, where the frost had grown into intricate, jagged patterns that looked exactly like a topographic map of the surrounding peaks. I felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the cold. I wasn't here because of a broken Humvee or a wrong turn. I had been selected, diverted by a force that understood the bond between those who wear the trident. I was the secondary unit called in when the primary could no longer engage. I stood up to pace the perimeter of the room, my boots creaking on the ancient wood, and as I passed a silver-backed mirror, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. In the reflection, I saw myself, covered in frost, eyes bloodshot from the wind. But standing directly behind me was the silhouette of another man. He was tall, wearing the old-school woodland camouflage of the early 2000s, his face partially obscured by the shadows of a boonie hat. His hand was resting near a vintage rifle slung low across his chest, and for a split second, our eyes met in the glass. The same steel-gray gaze of a man who had seen too much. I spun around, my hand instinctively going for a weapon that wasn't there, but the corner was empty. Only the smell of old pine and a faint, lingering trace of gun smoke remained in the air. He wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. He was a lingering echo of duty, a spectral guardian who had been holding the line for 20 years, waiting for someone to relieve him so he could finally rest. On the heavy oak table sat a leather-bound logbook, its edges worn smooth by decades of handling. I opened it, expecting to see the faded ramblings of a lonely woman, but the pages were filled with detailed patrol reports, weather observations, and tactical notes written in a precise military hand. I flipped to the very last page, and my heart skipped a beat. The date was today, and the ink was dark, shimmering as if it were still wet. The entry was short. Extraction impossible. Subject 1 in critical condition. Heat source secured. Relief scout on site. Mission handed over. Below the text was a set of GPS coordinates, the exact location of this cabin, followed by the initials ET. I touched the ink with my thumb, and it smeared slightly, still tacky. It was a direct order from a commanding officer who had been dead for 2 decades. I realized then that I wasn't just a rescuer. I was the relief he had prayed for. I had inherited a mission that had started before I even joined the Navy, and the responsibility felt heavier than any rucksack I had ever carried. The storm finally broke as the first light of dawn touched the peaks, turning the world outside into a blinding kingdom of crystal and light. The screaming gale died down to a rhythmic hum, and a pale, ethereal blue light filtered through the small windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the warm air. The woman was sleeping deeply now, her breathing slow and steady, her face finally free of the mask of pain it had worn in the ravine. The dog lay across the door, its head on its paws, guarding the entrance to our sanctuary with a quiet, unwavering devotion. I sat by the stove, the silver locket clutched in my hand, watching the fire die down to a soft orange glow. I felt a strange, profound peace, a sense of closure that extended far beyond this single night. I had spent my life looking for meaning in the chaos of war, but here, in a forgotten cabin at the edge of the world, I had found the purest form of service. We were 3 souls bound by a storm, protected by a man who refused to let death stop him from doing his job. The distant, rhythmic thrum of rotors began to vibrate through the floorboards, growing louder until it filled the valley. Search and rescue. I walked to the door and stepped out into the waist-deep powder, squinting against the brilliance of the morning sun. From this height, I could see the path we had taken, or rather, the lack of it. The old spirit trail was completely invisible, buried under a fresh 6-foot blanket of snow, leaving no trace of how we had moved through the dense timber. There were no tracks behind us, only a smooth, undisturbed white void, as if we had been carried across the mountain by the wind itself. I signaled the helicopter, my movements mechanical and weary. As the bird hovered above the clearing, kicking up a blinding cloud of snow, I looked back at the cabin one last time. It looked like a tomb again, a silent wooden shell, but I knew better. It was a fortress of the spirit, a place where the line between life and death was as thin as a layer of frost on a window pane. As the rescue team scrambled toward the cabin to retrieve the woman, I stood by the open door of the helicopter, the downwash of the blades whipping my hair. I felt a sudden heavy pressure on my right shoulder, the distinct, firm grip of a teammate's hand, the way we acknowledge a job well done after a brutal operation. It was a grip of steel, full of brotherhood and a silent, "Thank you." I turned my head, expecting to see a medic or a pilot, but there was no one behind me. The space was empty, save for the swirling crystalline snow. I looked back at the cabin door and saw the dog standing there, watching me depart with a solemn, ancient gaze. I realized then that Ethan Thorne hadn't been a ghost I was meant to save. He was the one who had saved me from the emptiness of my own life. I climbed into the bird, the silver locket tucked safely into my pocket. We are never truly alone in the dark. A seal never leaves a man behind, and as the helicopter rose into the clear blue sky, I knew that some missions don't end with a medal. They end with a quiet promise to keep the watch, just like he did.